Hello, this is Chris Waddell. Welcome to Living It. And today I am super excited. I'm with Kate Miliken. Kate and I met back in 2008. I had just done my scouting trip on Mount Kilimanjaro, and I was in New York, and a buddy of ours, a mutual friend, John Lawrence, said, "You need to meet Kate." And when John tells me I need to meet someone, it really is important that I meet that person. And so we had brunch like at Robert De Niro's place in Tribeca, and just hung out and had become friends. And you had gone through, so 2006 is when you got your diagnosis, your MS diagnosis. We're going to talk about how she attacked her diagnosis. And in 2007, you had a checkup that was really kind of an unbelievable checkup. So I met you in 2008. Something you don't know, you got your diagnosis right around the December 20th, 21st, 22nd, right? My accident was December 20th, where I broke my back,
Wow.
which in some ways is like a new birthday, isn't it? It's kind of like you go to the doctor and you know you've got to write down your birthday, but you know you also have to write down that day because it's the significant day in some ways. And so we're like second birthday Sagittariuses, I guess.
I love that we both kind of started a different trajectory around the same time, and that you and I have stayed friends all the way through that, and checked in with each other kind of throughout our respective journeys. So I didn't know that, and I think that's awesome.
Well, I learned that in our research. And in some ways, it's kind of like the Mark Twain quote where he said the two most significant days in your life are the day you're born and the day you realize why. And in some
Yeah.
ways, that second birthday for us has become our reason why. And so,
Yes. And I think, yeah, go ahead.
anyway, so can you take me back to, so you got the diagnosis that you had MS, which is one of those that you don't even really know what's going on, right? So one, can you tell me where you were in your life when you got that diagnosis and then what it meant to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the time when I was diagnosed, I was 35 and I was living in New York City, right square in the middle of Manhattan. I was an independent video producer and I was doing a lot of freelance gigs. And I was really living my life kind of to the fullest in the sense of really being a pusher. So a typical day at the time where I started getting sick was, waking up, biking 40 miles before breakfast in Central Park, taking a shower, getting together with a crew, going to interview people. Sometimes we would have to interview 4 or 5 different clients in a day around Manhattan. So we would pack our gear, go to a location, take all the gear upstairs, set up, run an interview, break down, put it back in a cab, and go to the next location, which is a lot of effort. And then I would come back home and I would take a shower and I would go out on a date or go meet with friends and drink, half a bottle of wine and do it 6 days in a row. So in some ways, it was a very exciting time because I was running on all cylinders. And I think that that's in some ways what made that moment of diagnosis such a surreal moment because everything was moving forward. And then, waking up one day and realizing that, I had tingling in my hands and that I had crushing fatigue. But, were things that I thought were unusual. And then the way that my MS manifested was that I ended up having a whole delay on my left side. So even though my brain was telling my body to, walk, I could just tell something was off. And so by the time I got my MS diagnosis, I couldn't even keep my balance. And I think when you talk about that day, I mean, for you in the moment of having your birthday, the accident happened in seconds for you.
Right.
And for me, I had kind of a 3-day trajectory where I knew something was off. And then I was hitting Google and I was saying to my parents, oh my God, what if I have MS?
So you actually thought that you thought that it could have been MS beforehand, because there's a part of, I mean, you're driving yourself so hard
Right.
that you're like, okay, well, you're being crazy. You're driving yourself too hard. This is your body telling you, hey, let's take a break. Let's just sleep. But you thought it
Right.
could have been MS.
Well, I started realizing, I think that, first of all, if anyone who is listening deals with any type of chronic fatigue or immune kind of, kick-started fatigue, it's really unusual to go to bed at 8 o'clock, wake up at 8 o'clock the next morning, and not feel rested. So I knew that was really weird. And then, this tingling was so unsettling. There's something in MS called Lermet syndrome, where you put your head down and you get this shock down your spinal cord. And I was having that. So I was typing things into Google, and it was coming up. I still didn't understand what MS was. In fact, I thought I was getting the same diagnosis as Michael J. Fox, who most people know has Parkinson's. It just, at the time, MS wasn't as mainstream as it is now. It was pretty unusual. But my kind of birthday happened in kind of this 3 day block of, and I was alone. I think it's important to say I was a 35 woman who was a 35-year-old who was single in Manhattan. And one could certainly argue being single in Manhattan at age 35 is almost as bad, if not worse, than an MS diagnosis. That's a whole other conversation.
I think we'll get to that conversation.
We can. And anyway, so, this moment, I will never forget this flashbulb moment. And again, I'm sure you can relate to that too, where I got an MRI, and I remember being by myself, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and the doctor said, your MRI has come back and you have an enormous lesion on your C4 vertebrae. I know it's MS, and in light of where it is and the size of it, you could be paralyzed. Go to a hospital. I've got a bed waiting for you. Don't even pack. And I think that moment was just like, it was so dramatic and so sudden and so lonely. And I'll just kick in. It was December 22nd. And if anyone's been in New York City around Christmas time, I mean, it's festive, and, everyone's running around with their children, and, getting into a taxi to get myself to the hospital was pretty surreal. And actually, as a video producer and a personal documentarian, I remember hanging up the phone, and literally 6 inches away from me was a video camera. And I had that dialogue of like, should I be taking this with me and starting to roll tape right now? And in that moment of fear, I couldn't do it. In that moment, I couldn't do it. So that's how it all kind of began.
Because you also, by virtue of what you did professionally, you saw your life in scenes in some ways too, right? Where
Yes.
this is a scene, that is a scene. Okay, you're starting to build the story, even though it's your own story, which is a strange thing. So that's a crushing moment. I mean, that is a moment where, and C4 effectively means that's your neck. That means that you'll have limited hand function, that you'll have limited arm function. That is a power chair. That is potentially sip and puff, where you might have to use your mouth to be able to direct a wheelchair. And so this is going from 6 laps in the morning of Central Park to how do I get around my apartment?
The severity and the drasticness of which this guy was like, get to the hospital, don't even pack, was crazy. And in some ways, I think when you know something's wrong and you get a diagnosis, you'll often hear people say it was a terrible diagnosis, but in some way it was a relief. And I think that, I hadn't gotten far enough in my Google research to realize that I would be, potentially puffing. It's interesting from your perspective of what a C4 vertebrae means, but I knew it was serious, and I knew something was very, very wrong. And but in that time, I think no matter where you are in an adversity, there is such a moment of loneliness that comes with that. Because if, for me personally, no one was in my apartment, right? So I was having to like find a cab on the street, and trying to process that shock on your own, feels terrible. And in the days that followed, so I went to the hospital, and I got a huge dose of steroids, which reduced the inflammation. And I went down to Florida to be with my parents. And, my father would always crack jokes. I have a twin brother, and he was off with his family. He had a nuclear family. So it was the year that he was with his in laws. And my dad would always joke, at the ripe old age of 35 on Christmas morning, like, did Santa come? It was like a total humiliation hanging out with my parents at the age of 35 on Christmas. And we were in a beautiful place in Florida. And it was just one of those things where everything around me was so pretty. And I was left literally on my own trying to find a foothold of understanding what was going on and what this meant and whatever else. And that's a really scary time, I think, in the journey.
Well, it's a scary time, and you talk about the loneliness, which is interesting because anybody who would have met you would have said, "There's no way that Kate is lonely." I mean, she's with people all the time. She's out on dates. She is this vibrant, just attractive, intelligent. I mean, like why could it ever possibly be a worry for Kate that she might not have a partner, that she seems like she's not, like she's failing in New
Right.
York City, but yet your perspective was entirely different than what other people were thinking. How do you reconcile the two? Because people be like, Kate, you're crazy. You've got it all. What do you mean? How could you possibly be lonely?
Right. Well, first, I would say, I think that when people hear bad news about somebody, somebody's father suddenly died, somebody lost a child, somebody has cancer, somebody had an accident that put them in the wheelchair, whatever. In that moment, as a friend, it's amazing to watch how people react, because you may have a world of people who love you, but in that actual time, having the courage to try to respond directly, try to reach out. I don't think it happens amongst, let's say you have 1,000 friends. I would say that there are less than 100 that have the strength to pick up a telephone and say, "Oh my God, I heard the news. I'm so sorry. I don't really know what to say." And I do remember thinking to myself, because you're right, I'm really lucky to have an amazing support network and a great social life. But in that time, I think you're looking for people that can directly face it, can, be in touch with you directly to say, "I'm really sorry." And then you're also looking for people that understand and who have been through it or who are going through it. So I think people always say, you don't really understand it unless you're dealing with it. But I think there are two separate things there. So I will always remember my friends who had the courage to pick up the phone to say that they were thinking of me, or "I'm so sorry," and is there anything I could do, and whatever else.
It's interesting that you say that. We lost my mother a couple of Christmases ago, just uh, really suddenly. I mean, no expectation whatsoever. And my father posted something on Facebook about that people will avoid talking about it. And because they don't want to stir up any bad memories. They don't want to make it emotional for you. They don't want to make it difficult for you. And he said, well, that's what you
Is
miss.
it really about you? I mean, that's the irony, right?
It
It's about them.
it really is, and people just don't know. And the thing is, none of us know. I mean, it's one of our biggest challenges is trying to figure out how we can start that conversation and how we can be vulnerable enough to be able to say, she was an amazing person. She did this for me. And he's like, those memories are the things that are so important. That personal connection continues to be the thing that's so important. But yet, if this barrier, if a sudden loss, if a diagnosis becomes that barrier between you and people, then you've lost the people. And this is the isolation and the loneliness that you're talking about. And you had to pursue your recovery on your own because I mean MS in a lot of ways is, well, go prepare to die. Like it's going to get worse. And what did you do? How did things work for you? Because it worked a little differently than it worked for a lot of people.
Well, I will say that, it becomes a blessing and a curse that with MS. So, for those that don't know, MS is an inflammation of the central nervous system, and your body gets confused for whatever reason, and it actually attacks your own myelin sheath, that you can find in your brain and your spinal cord. So, if you equate your spinal cord to a garden hose and your brain wants to send an impulse to snap your fingers, if there are holes in the garden hose, then you're going to lose the ability to have function. And it can have a cognitive effect as well. What you learn immediately with MS is that it's wildly individual. So you don't know what's going to happen to you. And when you start the MS journey, there is nothing worse than hearing that. And what's interesting is that because you're encased in fear, I think most people's brain goes to a half empty perspective. I don't know what's going to happen. I could be in a wheelchair. It could lead to, more serious progression and ultimately, have ramifications that lead to death. But it's interesting that you could also say it could do that or not, right? There's just as much chance as half full as half empty from the get go. And I think at the time in 2007, they had made great progress in terms of treatments in the MS space. I don't quote me, but there were probably 8 or 9 therapies that were out in 2007. Now there are like over 20. So it's a neurological condition that actually is making enormous progress in terms of conventional therapy, which is fabulous. And it's giving hope that people who come out of the gate with a relapsing remitting form of MS, which is the most mild case, can lead a manageable life. For me, I ended up knowing that my motor function got back, and I appeared fairly normal, but I felt terrible inside. It's hard to explain how sick I felt. And when I ended up going to a doctor, a specialist, one of the best specialists in the world, and saying, how are you going to make me feel better? They would say, we can't help you. Like if you're holding a glass and you drop the glass, we can help you. But if not, that's just the nature of MS. And I think that there's a point where you have to, when somebody gives you a statement of finality, like, what do you do with that?
There's a big question, right? It's so personal. It's funny, as you were saying that, it's not a great example, but I couldn't help but think of Jim Carrey from Dumb and Dumber, where he's like, so you mean there's a chance? And it's
Right.
like, yeah, 1 in a million, there's a chance. And obviously your odds were much better than that. But I think it gets to where you have to define it yourself. It's undefinable because in so many ways everybody's road is different and they can't make you feel better. So then the responsibility falls in your lap. And obviously there were some treatments.
Yes. But I went on treatment immediately and I was still feeling terribly, and it is true. No one cares about you as much as you do. Like it's your problem ultimately, in terms of how you deal with it. And I think that, I was super lucky. As you said, I feel like I know a lot of people, and as this kind of MS thing unfolded, more and more people found ways to be in touch and be courageous. And somebody put me in touch, and coordinated a meeting with a wonderful guy named Dr. Mark Hyman, who actually has gotten a lot of attention recently, and he's a functional medicine doctor. And we had a cocktail, and he said, "Have you had your heavy metals checked?" And I said, "No." And he said, it would be worth you doing that. So he kind of led me into this world of functional medicine, which in 2007 was pretty still considered kind of out there. And I ended up finding an incredible osteopath named George Kessler, who's located in New York City. And when we had our first appointment, he said, I don't really care that you have MS. Why do you have it? It's an inflammation of the central nervous system. What might be inflaming you? And he did a ton of stool tests and blood tests and had my heavy metals checked. And we found out that I had extremely high levels of mercury in my system. I had 9 mercury fillings and I ground my teeth a lot. And I thought that was the cause. And I had bad bacteria in my gut. So when he said, look, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get these mercury fillings removed with a holistic dentist. So you'll hear, if you even go down this rabbit hole about getting rid of your fillings, some will tell you that when you start moving mercury in your mouth, it's more dangerous. And there are dentists out there who recognize that and work really carefully to remove it. So I had 9 fillings. I had 5 appointments. Each one were, 2.5 hours. There were 3 people around me getting the fillings removed: the dentist, the nurse with the strong suction, and this wonderful nurse who was doing reflexology on me because I had to keep my mouth open for 2 hours at a time. And it was super intense.
Can you describe what reflexology is, Please.
Yeah, so it's hitting pressure points, and in this case, in your hands, that help release tension in other parts of your body. And at the same time, I had an osteopath who was carefully giving me chlorophyll. So as they were removing the mercury, it was chelating from the inside. So that was one thing I did. And then the other thing I did is this guy put me on a supplemental regimen, and, taking nutrients. And I don't want to get too micro, but I'll just give you one example of this whole idea of having bad bacteria in your gut, which is what they're now calling a microbiome issue. And the whole concept of it is that your body just doesn't process things normally. So I will tell you that the moment I got diagnosed with MS, I started taking vitamin D. In fact, I took a 200% of the daily allotment because I'd read vitamin D was really good for you and you can't overdose on it. And I took it every single day. And when this osteopath got my blood results back, I had 10% of the vitamin D I needed. I said, "What are you talking about? I've been taking it every day for 6 months." And he said, "Your body's just flushing it through." So that was number two. And what he said to me exactly was, "I'm going to wipe out the bad bacteria in your gut, re-inoculate the good bacteria, rebalance your system, and ideally you will heal yourself." And then he said, "Kate, I have been in med school and I know they teach you cannot reverse myelin damage, but I've seen it happen in my practice and I would plan on it."
I would plan on it. Wow.
And that for me, as a type A doer who was just dying for a sense of proactivity and control, took that so seriously. And, I put a post it on my mirror and I had two words, which became my mantra: reverse it. And I became so convinced that if I, took my conventional therapy and took this supplemental regimen, which in fairness was out of network, super extensive and super expensive, that I could reverse my own lesion. And I thought about that, 1,000 times a day. And what was interesting about it was, in that time of kind of accepting the fact that everyone around me in New York was going somewhere and their life was great. And I, from that moment of diagnosis, especially being in Florida, I was like, I'm going to be the girl that people at cocktail parties are like, "Oh my God, Kate Miliken, like she had so much potential, dot, dot, dot." You know what I mean? Like it's over. And that was a really big deal, in terms of feeling like that was like the rock bottom fear. And this gave me something to hang on to. So just the rest of the story is that I was so convinced I was going to reverse my lesion on my MRI that I brought a camera crew to Mount Sinai where I was being treated. And the doctors thought I was crazy. And they pulled out the MRI and there was nothing there. And the lesion reversed itself. And now here we are 12 years later. I'm so happy to report they are now showing there's a correlation between the microbiome and MS and other immune issues, and that you can regenerate myelin. So that's like 12 years ahead of the curve.
Look at you, trailblazer. That's awesome. And thank you for all the people following behind you. It's interesting. So you had the post it and you had the out thing as well, right? So out and reverse it were your two mantras in a lot of ways of like, okay, this is the way I'm going to do it. And we as human beings really want to be sort of fundamentalist on some way, right? Like we crave this sense of like black and white. And it's like, okay, good, bad, makes my life simple, right? And life for the most part is pretty much in the grays. You knew what the enemy was. The enemy was the disease.
Hmm.
And you had an action. You had things that you could do. But the question is, why were you doing it? What were you doing it for?
So I actually think that's an amazing question because I think if you break free of the actual disease activity itself, I think that process of really trying to, stop your negative thinking in its tracks, accept where you are and start to rebuild takes this whole story out of the specific of MS and more into a human journey. I mean, I think that, the greatest lesson I think for me as somebody who everything was pushing and moving forward and fast and hard, and I think that bigger thing of having to stop dead in your tracks, and having to accept that, you know, when my best friend called to tell me that he was having his second baby, right? Of being like, oh my God, you know? And I remember giving tons of congratulations, hanging up the phone, bursting into tears, and then out loud saying over and over, like, believe, 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 you know? And so I think that the greater thing was really beginning to um, just become much more self-aware and really just tapping into like a different energy and flow of being human and being present and being good to yourself and gentle to yourself. And I feel like this gave me an incredible foundation to kind of really stop being all about me.
Well, stop all being about you, but also being all about you, right? In some ways, it's
Right.
almost like because you're ultimately realizing that you are responsible for this
Yes.
vessel.
That's right. It's like you're right. It's like both, one is being about me, about, you know, just moving forward, and one is more about being aware of being all about me.
Right, because you'd lived the life that in a lot of ways we're taught to live. Like you live off of adrenaline. You push, you go, you make it happen, and you're
You
using
achieve,
you
right?
achieve, and you're using this vessel that you have, and in a lot of ways, completely abusing it without
Yeah.
any regard for who we are. And is it easy to continue to remember now that things are better, you've reduced the lesions, you're
Hmm.
not in that critical moment where every single thought, every single thing that you put into your body is important.
Right.
Can you remember now? Can you how do you keep that conviction now?
Look, I think there is something so powerful about gratitude, which is something I think has become very mainstream in a wonderful way. I think that I mean, for me personally, part of my healing ended up becoming meeting other people living with MS and gaining perspective from them. So I think that one way that I never forget where I'm at today is being around other people who are living the same problem and watching how they are trying to get better themselves. So, you know, I've been in remission for a long time. I certainly have moments where I can feel it, kind of, you know, whether it's tingling or fatigue, it will kind of come up and down. But ultimately, whether it's true or not, I do feel like I have a sense of control on it. And so I would say my answer is really looking at other people and, you know, deciding that part of, you know, in that healing time, that first year, one of the things I was able to find, I found somebody who I could emotionally relate to, who had done really well with MS. She was a really cool woman named Tyler. She was my age. She had gotten married. And that was, I would say, maybe the fourth element of my healing is being consoled by someone who got it, who had an incredible attitude. So I surround myself with people who have this problem, and I constantly am in conversation about how to come to terms with where you're at. And I would say that is the answer of how I stay where I am today.
So part of it is teaching, right? It's like you're held to a higher level of responsibility as a result of being a teacher, but your path is not necessarily the path for other people, right? Some woman
Right.
said to you, "Don't tell me to put post-it notes on my mirror." How do you help them through, or how do you help each other through a journey which is a different journey?
I think that, look, with MS comes disability and comes limitations that arguably are finite, and I don't have any of them today. So I cannot directly relate to that. But I think that there are ways of having people get off the simple fact of what they don't have and finding ways to expand their thinking in terms of what they can do or how they can work around it. So, I mean, you are a tremendous example of this, Chris, that you could have just chosen to have a hard stop in your thinking and be at a dead end. And I watch people reframe. So, I've watched people, you know, if I'm online with people and we're chatting or you know, I've been involved with some online communities that, I've literally watched someone who started, conversing with me and many other people, who was just really angry. And over time, I saw a post where this person said, I'm so mad that my hand doesn't work, but at least my feet do. And that moment of adding that second part of the sentence changed the trajectory of his healing completely.
It is about being healthy in some ways, I think, right? I mean, that's I look back on it, and so as I said, my accident happened December 20th, and it was in a lot of ways, it was the greatest time of my life after my accident, which sounds
Tell me why.
I will. It sounds idiotic in a lot of ways, right? And people look at me and go, "Wow." And it was the greatest time because it was the most powerful I've ever been. It was the most me that I've ever been. I think that we all look and think that we see that potential. You hit on this. Oh, Kate Milliken, she had so much potential. And
Right.
that's human though. I mean, we all feel that way that it's like, the pat on the back as a little kid, like, oh, you're amazing. You have so much potential. And that's this warm feeling. But after my accident, I couldn't indulge in any of the things that sort of took me away from who I was in my most powerful form.
Mm,
So the frustration, if I'm frustrated, it draws me away from who I am. It draws me out of that moment of staying in that moment, the optimism, continuing to believe. It's something that I call realizing possible. and
uh-huh.
and possible is like we have our big goals, right? I mean, we all have, this is my goal, but realizing possible is realizing it in that moment,
Right.
because we set our goals when things are all cool. You're sitting on your
Right.
couch, your desk, you're like, oh yeah, like that'd be awesome, that'd be great. But then something goes wrong, and it's even just like I competed as an athlete for a long time, and you wake up in the morning and it's raining and you go, all right, I don't really want to go right now.
Yeah.
Or
Right.
or is this the realizing possible? This is the building who I am. It's a building, an incremental building of who I am as an individual, and building that positive momentum that takes me so much further away, because like you, it was frightening to see the diagnosis and the potential, and to think that could be my life. Like my life could be over at 20 years old.
Right. And that the over is something that you inflict. So I'll tell you from my personal experience is I have been around people and I have watched them progress with MS to the point they need an assistive device, whether it's a cane or a walker or a wheelchair. And I have watched their emotional response to that fact being angry, sad, scared, overwhelmed, arguably kind of negative feelings and being so mad. And then I've watched them make the choice to get the assistive device. And after they get it, then they start talking about themselves in way of being hopeful, determined, happy, because they have their freedom back. I mean, these are people that were wildly dependent on other people who were exhausted. And somehow everybody says the first comment with MS, oh my God, am I going to be in a wheelchair? Right? That's like the worst fear.
Right.
And when you actually watch people who find themselves tipping over that cliff, going to that place, watching what happens when they actually get there is incredible.
And I want to talk about your film now, because that's the hopeful part. It's the part that we actually share. So
Mhm.
you were talking about being in New York and doing everything and riding your bike and go 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 and going on dates, but being lonely
Yeah.
as well, which you think, wow, she's killing it. She's doing everything, but you don't have that hopeful spark as much there, where then you're talking about contrasting it, people who are getting an assistive device, whose lives are going down to a certain extent, but then are actually hopeful. And
Right.
in watching your film, Beneath the Surface, it really is that human journey, right? It really is that sense of being hopeful. It was funny, the doctor at one point said, said when retreat happens, the brain suffers.
Yeah,
And
right.
and in a lot of ways, that is kind of what happens as we get older as well, right? That we don't start trying something new, that we do what we do and we don't do something new. We're not stretching ourselves in this sense
Right.
of hopefulness. I mean, I assume that your intention with the film was to make that personal connection to, this isn't about me, it's about
Right.
you.
Right. So last fall, we were lucky enough to get some funding from Novartis, me and a production company called the Nantucket Project, to produce a 30-minute film about people living with MS. And the whole idea came out of the fact that I have been through being online with people living with MS in an online community. I've just met these extraordinary people. And when I actually look at the people I know, specifically the majority of them who I've known for over 5 years, most of them are getting worse. I'm literally watching them have more symptoms and more progression. And this ranges from somebody who has serious cognitive challenges to somebody who has become a quadriplegic to somebody who needs a feeding tube and can't get out of bed. And one of the things that I became hyper aware of getting to know these people is um, their resilience and in the face of the reality of what they were dealing with was incredible. So they had this ability just to own it, not to sugarcoat it, not to hide it, but just to almost use it as a lens of which to kind of move to their next chapter. And the thing I love about this film, so it's a montage, it's kind of, you meet 10 different characters, ranging from me to someone who's been diagnosed for a week and a half to these people I'm telling you about, to Montel Williams, who's in this film, talking about MS. And what I love is that these people aren't, the Nantucket Project did a wonderful job really documenting these people as they are. So, for example, there's a great woman named Diana Fristacci who's in the film. She's a
Mhm.
young mother. She's super funny. But these cognitive challenges are a really big deal. And her exact words were, I used to be Comedy Central and now I'm Sesame Street. She knows her brain is different. And she has problems with thinking of words. And there's one moment where she's in the car and she's trying to say, I was in an MRI, and she says something to the effect of, and I had these round things around my ears that they stop the sound, and they are circles. And and the producer was able to say, or the director, headphones, earphones, yeah, that's it. And catching that type of thing on camera is something I think people shy away from. But I think the mistake is, like, I don't think people give others who are debilitated in whatever way enough credit for knowing the truth and seeing the truth and seeing why it's hard. And they assume that that's going to spiral people into a vortex of depression. And what I think that film has done is it's had the opposite effect, because I don't leave it feeling sorry for anybody.
Well, that's an interesting question because I think that we're up against three different things, aren't we? Like first, we're up against how people see us.
Yep.
So as somebody with MS, you're on the outside looking in to a certain extent. Uh, then it's how we see ourselves. Then it's how we think other people see us.
Right.
And
Right.
sometimes we don't give them enough credit, but telling those stories and finding a way, I mean, like looking at the drummer and he's saying, I play a little bit differently now, but it's a little groovier, and I think it's actually better. And
Yeah.
you go, well, all right. Like that's, I mean, that's what we hope. Like we as human beings have this amazing ability to adapt if we
Right.
allow ourselves, if we put ourselves in the position to adapt. What's been the response to the film?
So I feel like the response has been wonderful, and it will be more formally launched in the next couple months. But for those that are watching, you can find it on beneaththesurfacefilm.com. Um, I think I got a slew. I kind of launched it into my community, and I got a slew of thank yous. Thank you for showing what MS really is. Thank you for not being afraid to put it out there. I was so impressed by these people who find new ways to kind of move on or whatever else. And so I would say it's been really positive. It's beautifully shot. Which I really love. So I think people, even if they're in a sort of compromised situation, still look like rock stars, and they are in their own way. So I think it's been really, really positive, and it just warrants this discussion of throwing it in your face. And one thing with MS is some people have visible symptoms, and some people have invisible symptoms. And which is worse. And a couple months ago, I interviewed somebody named Alana Duffy, who was a veteran, totally unrelated, but I interviewed her. She had a terrible traumatic brain injury while serving, and for years and years she suffered. And as a after effect of the TBI, she had to have a leg amputated. And she said, Kate, you cannot believe how interesting it's been for me to walk into a rehab center and see the difference of how I'm treated with a TBI versus missing a leg.
It is amazing, right? And that's a big part of the film is about telling your story, right?
Yep.
And so like with Montel and with the engineer, where you're telling why do you need to tell your story? What's so important about this? Because obviously with the film, you had to tell your story as well.
Yeah. Look, I think that personal storytelling is where it's at because it takes everybody to the same place, which is being human. And I think that people generally appreciate a great story. Stories are hard when you hear about people suffering, but that suffering can be incredible primer to a great story if someone comes around to the other side, right? So what I'm most proud about that film is getting to share these story arcs. And I'll just give you one more, which is a guy named Sergio Rodriguez, who's out of Arizona. Um, and when he was diagnosed, it was very serious. He got Bell's palsy, and he was pretty debilitated, and he was supposed to be married. And he had to go to a rehab facility. And when he came back, the fiance had moved out. And at this point, he was pretty overweight. He weighed like, I don't, 280 pounds. I mean, he was obese. And he came back and spiraled into a depression. And he realized that the day of his supposed wedding, which wasn't happening anymore, was the day of the Walk for MS. And he showed up for the MS walk, and it kickstarted a regimen of him getting in shape. He now runs marathons. He looks fantastic. He ended up going to work for the MS Society, and he just got married last year to somebody who loved him for who he is. So that to me is a great story. It's so terrible what happened to him in the beginning, but how far he came. And that's one thing I think with storytelling is you may not know somebody, but storytelling allows you to know how far they've come, and that's strong.
Right. And hopefully to be able to put yourself in the position of that person, right? I mean, that's the hope for every piece of art is to become the protagonist. In looking at some of these people and looking at the film, sometimes you look at it and you go, well, these are superheroes. Like these are the people who are just doing it. Like, what do I have to learn from the superheroes? How are you able to explain that side of it? Can they relate to the superheroes?
I think they can totally relate to the superheroes. So the reason why I met all these people is after living kind of my issue of loneliness, I decided to create my own online community in a venture called My Counterpain. And My Counterpain allowed people to kind of lay out their story in moments. We built this storytelling tool, which we called the moodifier, or you got to moodify. And what that means is when you posted a story, I mean, a moment, you'd have to pick one of 13 emotions and a date and why you felt that way. And what came out of it was you literally saw a visual graph of an emotional journey, and you broke people's story into these searchable moments of content. So on My Counterpain, you had the ability to say, I'm 35. I'm looking for someone who's 35 in New York with relapsing or remitting MS, who's on Copaxone, who's scared. And with these incredible search criteria, what would come up were exact moments that related. And one of the things I know is all you need is one moment from somebody's story to connect that gives you this incredible automatic healing power. And so, what I loved about this platform, which has since been put on ice, was that it allowed people to see the constant emotional ups and downs. So you might view these people as superheroes, but if you went back into kind of their profiles. I'm on an island. That is a noon bell. Don't get nervous. Just to be clear, we're watching Lost as a family right now, and we've all started thinking about this island as having some weird powers. Anyway, um, but you can see that everybody has infallible moments. Everybody, and fallible moments that are really hard. And I think that actually it's like, as a result of seeing that they're human, as a result of seeing their weakness and vulnerability, that's what makes them the superheroes. So personal storytelling, if it's done well, allows you to really understand the tough parts, which actually play ultimately a lot more poignantly than just glossing it over.
Which we as human beings have a desire to gloss it over, right?
Sometimes we do, yes. Unless you're really feeling horrible, you probably want to find someone who's been there, right?
I think that's exactly it because I mean, I do it all the time, where people ask me, "Oh, life in a wheelchair must be so difficult." And I'm like, "No, no, it's fine. It's no big deal." Right?
Huh,
And
right?
and for the most part it really is, but this is, I think, what you're talking about. For me, it's always this sense of honesty. Like the more honest you can be, the more general you ultimately are.
Well, I think that I made a choice early on that I was going to be completely honest about my MS. And so, for example, I'd go out on a date, and on the second date, I might bring it up. And my immediate response was, I have MS. And then I would say, do you know what MS is? And it would engage a conversation. And I think that I watch a lot of people hide their diagnosis and not want to talk about it. And I think that if you have the power to own what your issue is in a way that you've, been thoughtful about it and you can be strong presenting it, it actually flips the table. So for example, with your comment of, yeah, it's actually okay. That leaves people actually feeling like it's on them now. Like you're fine with it. And I think that's incredibly powerful.
I mean, when you talk about that, it's a really interesting part, isn't it? Just the sense of how we work with other people, how we look at them, how they look at us,
Mhm.
and I mean, even putting it out there, I think that sometimes it's so easy for the thing in our head
Yeah.
to be the most debilitating thing, the thing that we're hiding in our head.
Right.
And I do a lot of these school presentations, and I often say in our school presentations to kids, we think that that's what makes us different, that makes us separate from other people, is like this thing that I'm hiding, but it's human. Everybody has that thought of like, oh, if anybody knew this about us, about me,
Right.
I'd be on the outside looking in. But it's also the most powerful.
Right. So in your experience, because my understanding of, with your moment of change, that you came out of the gate pretty confident and pretty, I wouldn't say matter of fact, but recognizing kind of a choice to kind of throw it out there from the start. Is there anything you feel like you hid in the beginning that took you a while to expose?
Anything that I hid, yes, most definitely, because action was easy. Action was
Hmm.
easy for me. So I had to do the physical stuff. I had to figure out. I mean, you break your back, it's not just about getting around. It's like all of the attendant things, the bowel and bladder and all that stuff and everything, which is way more difficult to figure out than, hey, get in a wheelchair and use your arms instead of using your legs.
Yeah.
So certainly, and that's the stuff that you don't necessarily want to talk about
Yeah.
either. But so the action part, I was in the hospital for 2 months. I said, I am going back to school. I went to Middlebury College, which is at that point was an almost 200-year-old school, built mostly out of granite on the top of a hill in northern Vermont in the middle of February. And it's like, that's where I want to go. And it's like, really?
Slippery much? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what are you thinking? That is completely idiotic. But
Oh,
it was
funny.
where my community was. It was where my friends were. It was where my life was. My life was not in the hospital. I didn't share much with the people who were in the hospital with me.
Yeah.
Short of like the doctors and therapists, and I gravitated toward them because they were my gateway out of there. And it's a strange thing, right? It's a strange thing because if you have a spinal cord injury, the only way that you become whole is by walking again.
Hmm. Right. Well, the typical definition of whole.
I didn't know any better. I really
Right.
didn't know any better because it's not like I have any education on this stuff.
Right.
I don't know anything. So I went and said, okay, I'm going to walk out of here. This is it. I will walk eventually. I had to go back to school because that was getting out of the hospital. But then I actually went to a holistic healing center
Mhm.
that summer, a place called Shake Leg in Newport, Rhode Island. And it was interesting because having gone through the holistic part of it, we like the definition of holistic is really where you're dealing with, the mental and emotional as opposed to just the physical, dealing with the whole person.
Mhm.
But I feel like for us, there's probably a little bit more of a different definition. It's almost like, to me, holistic is really personal. It's
Yeah.
it's 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 me dealing with who I am and having all this help from a lot of other people around there, which seems like it was similar to your journey in like nobody has the answer for me, but
Right.
how can I help guide this journey so that I can be whole?
You know what it is? And you're right. It is really personal. It feels so like it's such a good way of putting it. It's almost like rebuilding yourself from the inside out. So what's the kernel that somehow, you're in this craziness of dealing, I'm in a wheelchair, I've got other issues, how are people reacting, how am I going to get up the Middlebury Hill, like whatever. And it's like, what grounds you enough to take a breath and restart? And for me, I had this incredible moment of going to a yoga class in my first few months, and I was all tingly. I was so determined to keep moving, even if like I could only do a little bit every day because MS stops you from moving. And I went into the yoga class and I was laying on the mat before it started, and I was crying. And this teacher came over and he said, "What's going on?" I said, "I was diagnosed with MS a month and a half ago, or a couple months ago, and I'm tingling. I'm not sure if I'm going into an episode, and I'm just really scared." And he put his hand on my shoulder and he just said, "It's okay. Like, you're here." And in that yoga class, getting to kind of stare at the mirror and be like, "You're here. Like right now, you're here. Like you in this moment, you are a warrior." And literally breaking down my future into moment by moment. So when I see somebody who's debilitated, right, I do have a moment of saying, "Not today." Like it could happen and my life might be better for it, who knows. But in that moment of "it's okay, not today," is very powerful for me. And then that, because you've settled, starts to gain more. So do you have a kernel like that happened to you?
Oh, I mean, it's in a lot of ways. I mean, I think some of what you're talking about is the sense of like of this endurance, and for me in the hospital, there certainly was that. I mean, that's the realized possible of like winning that moment. And it's
Right.
not it's not necessarily being successful in that moment. We're so oriented toward successful. Like I'm oriented toward finish lines. Like I get to
Right.
a finish
Hell
line
yeah, you are.
and it's like this is it. I've made it to the finish line.
Yeah.
But this is about winning the moment with myself.
Right. And it's before realize possible. Don't you
That
think?
well, it really is. I mean, well, in some ways for me, that is the realize possible is like, well, I have to win that moment in order to realize possible, right? Is
Exactly.
is this sense of like, okay, I want to give up. And it might be that nobody knows that I've given up
Yeah.
other than
Mm.
me, that I've given up in that moment. It's like it's the running up the steep hill and you're running and you're like, and you take that one moment where you're like, oh, I'm just going to back off just a little bit right now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and nobody else really knows it, but you know that your objective was to keep going at that same pace, and you just kind of drop just that little bit, and you're like, oh no,
I
I
know
need to come
exactly what you
back.
mean.
And it's the sense of not wanting to have to start over again, to
Right.
to rearm myself to start over and to be in that moment. And I think that it ultimately becomes a problem solving situation where everything that's coming at you is a problem. But it really is that stay it, for me, it's staying in the moment, because it's
Yeah.
so easy to quit. And as an athlete, it was easy to quit. It was easy to sort of give up, to have an excuse even
Yeah.
before you started. And it's the analogy for me is kind of like you're talking about, very similar. It's like it's being in it, like being
Yeah.
in the moment, like being dirty, as opposed to kind of being above it, where we
That's
feel
right.
like we're the puppet master and we're directing and we're in charge of everything, which is one of those where you think, I am really important.
It's funny. I feel like in the sport of cycling, of which I know you are one too, is I often think about those times where you take long, gradual hills where you are down to your last gear. There's nowhere to go. And you have a long way ahead of you. And you know that if you stop, it's like four times worse. So in that moment, how do you frame yourself to not think about the fact that you're going to have to do this for like another 25 minutes, and how do you stay in the moment to get up the hill?
Which is life in general, right? I mean,
Right.
this idea of like being in it because we think that we're so in charge and we can direct it. And it's like gaining a rhythm. You get in
Yeah.
and you go, okay, I can gain a rhythm. It's funny, a few years ago, my wife and I did 4 or 5 century rides. And we were doing a bunch of fundraising events, and so we'd go to them, and we did one in Park City, Utah, where we live, which was like 7 to 9,000 feet of climbing.
Wow.
It was
Owie, owie.
it was really, what was really interesting. There was 1 mile that was the steepest paved mile in the country, I guess, and it's only
Wow.
open for this event and for the tour of Utah. It's in a gated community, and we rode through there, and everybody's doing their switchbacks back and forth. And that doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
I just got into my Granite gear that you're talking about and just kind of grounded out. But what was funny from that was that there were so many of these hills that were 4, 5 mile just grinders. Just
Yeah.
you can't even begin to understand it, really. You just get in and you just keep going. I recovered so much more quickly from that ride than I did from these other rides that had the small hills, because I had to get into that rhythm and I
Yeah.
didn't try to overpower it. So we learn these lessons, and
Yeah.
sometimes we forget these lessons, but we learn these lessons. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of, I feel like I keep learning those moments over and over again. And do you feel like do you feel like that's part of who you are? You had that moment in the yoga class, but
Yeah.
is it something that you keep coming back to and going, oh yeah, right, I already learned that?
Yeah, look, yes, absolutely. And I actually think in this time of COVID, it's a really, really big test for everybody, because I think that, finding your own smart rhythm is what we're talking about. And that takes a lot of hard work. And that's where you start opening the possibility, of which you've done such a great job. But I do feel like, it was interesting to watch when COVID, in March, when the country kind of shut down. Everybody was brought to a halt, and everybody was put in the situation of understanding what was important and slowing things down and being more in the moment. And I also think, for what it's worth, in this day and age, that loneliness and isolation and the effects of that have become really clear, on a much larger scale. But I think now, as the world remains uncertain, we're all going into varsity level because finding a rhythm, when the world is questionable, I think begs a whole new, a whole new bike ride, Chris.
It's a really interesting point, Kate. If finding a rhythm, we are in charge, which can be a really scary thing, right? I mean, we think, oh, well, we need to be proactive. We need to be in charge. We need to take charge of our lives. But
Right.
yet, if we take charge of our lives and things don't work out as we hope,
Yeah.
then we're responsible for things. Whereas if we don't take charge, we're effectively a victim of circumstances. And you talk about COVID, and we're recording this in the middle of July. I'm
Yeah.
not sure when we are going to publish it, but I
Yep.
think that COVID is going to be newsworthy for a while, unfortunately. But how are you able to look at both of those things of wanting to be proactive, of wanting to create your rhythm, but yet assuming that responsibility and letting go of what sounds like a really crazy comfort, but the comfort of potentially being a victim of these things that are happening?
I do think one of the greatest lessons that I actually say to people, especially when they're newly diagnosed and kind of recalibrating, somebody once said to me, like, recognize that you're grieving your old self and honor that. So if you have moments of being upset or whatever, it's okay, but also being gentle on yourself, right? And I think that, like, that directive actually, although it sounds kind of passive, is enormously helpful and empowering.
Because you're empowered in the moment, because I don't know about you, but I am really good at the self-talk.
Like the bad self-talk or the good self-talk?
Oh, there's time where it's not super helpful, like, "Really, why did you do that, dumbass?" Like, "Why
Yeah,
would you possibly do that?" And
right.
it's the stuff that you'd never say to anybody else,
Yeah,
but seems easy enough to say to yourself. But switching that self-talk to a point where it's like, where you're, it's like if you're coaching somebody, and you're coaching somebody through a difficult time, you want to continue to build them, right? You want to continue to build their confidence, to their sense of self-worth. And why don't we do that for ourselves?
right.
Is a lot of what you're talking about, right?
It's really amazing how hard one can be on oneself, and that's where, on some level, the easiest way to become aware of that is having a network of people who understand or want to understand and want to be there for you, who can kind of show a mirror to you. And I do think that that is one way of kind of coming to terms with that. But when you are, I mean, again, you had a massive physical setback, and I had a disease diagnosis. And in those moments when you're getting back in the game, when you're wheeling outside for the first time, when you're like stepping on a treadmill for the first time, and you think you're at ground zero, um, it's actually very exciting to watch yourself expand, from a point of view where you thought you weren't going to be able to do anything.
It is amazing, isn't it, when you do that one thing and you think, "Oh, wow, like that was
You're like,
cool."
I did right. But the first time I got on a treadmill, I think I like, jogged 2 miles in a very gentle way. And wow, was I proud of myself because I thought that I was going to do zero.
Right, exactly. Versus the flip side of that, where prior to your diagnosis, you go out and you're riding 40 miles in the park, and you're not meeting your time. You're like, "Oh, well, I should be
Exactly.
doing
Yeah, should.
17, 18-minute laps. Like, why am I not doing 17, 18-minute laps around the park?" And
Right.
and this is a bad day, and you're starting off your day going, "Oh, well, that's a bad day." And then we're beating ourselves up and expecting ourselves to be productive
Yeah.
after beating ourselves up.
Right. And, I mean, I have dropped should from my vernacular completely. I don't let my family use it. I'd encourage you to, is a nice way of putting it. But it's a dangerous word, and it happens to all of us.
It is, and I think that it happens in the critical sense, right? In the critical, where it's life or death. And the life or death is like, I can't afford to be bad to myself right now,
Right.
because I need to continue to get better. I need to build this block, whatever the block is. You talk about 2 miles running on the treadmill, whatever that block is, I've got to build it as well as I can, as
Mm,
strong as I can, so that it can support the next one. And it can
that's
support
right.
the next one. And in some ways, it's like this little tiny little tile mosaic kind of thing, to
Right.
completely mix all my metaphors here. But it's like this tiny little stuff that you're building, and
Yeah.
each block is just like a tiny little block, but eventually you're getting somewhere. I keep going back to, in some ways, the and it's certainly appropriate with COVID as well, the that parable about the I'm going to get it wrong, about, I think it's Vishnu playing chess with a with I believe it was a king, and he ends up winning, and Vishnu is disguised as a beggar or whatever, and ends up playing chess and wins, and the king says, I'll give you whatever you want. And he said, well, I'm just a humble man. What I'd like is, I'd like 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard, and then to double it, so from 1 to 2 to 4. And the thing is, by the time it gets to like 13, if you go all the way to 64 squares, it covers all of India, like 6 meters deep,
Oh,
kind of
wow.
thing. And it is that sense of, like, something small can lead to something really big. And
That's right.
but it is allowing us ourselves to have that something small.
And if you do that, it actually, in some weird way, becomes fun.
It does. And enjoying things and enjoying life seems like a relatively good way to approach it. We've talked a bit about the sense of loneliness, and we've been around it, but what brought you to addressing loneliness as really as a crusade in some ways?
I feel like that those few days that I was able to describe earlier in this podcast were so profound for me, in terms of, being surrounded by a lot of opportunity, but still feeling terribly, alone and by myself, and that deep sense of fear. I just never forgot what that felt like. And what's been interesting is, in the past, I would say 7 years, I've really had my eye on the whole world of loneliness. And, in 2017, the Surgeon General actually deemed loneliness the greatest epidemic of our time, bigger than cancer, bigger than diabetes. They equate feelings of loneliness being the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, having negative biological effects. And there's a wonderful little news piece that I saw a couple years ago on NPR that I think was really powerful. And it was done by a correspondent named Barbara Bradley Haggerty. And she went down to the University of Virginia, where they were studying friendship in the brain. And she brought her best friend, Cherie. They put her in a scanner and they showed her a series of green check marks and red X's. So when she saw a green check mark while she was in the MRI or whatever it was, nothing happened. But when she saw a red X, 1 out of 5 times that she saw it, she would receive a shock. So if you know anything about Pavlov, you would know that every time she saw a red X in the scanner, her brain would light up. The areas of fear and danger would light up like a Christmas tree, except when she was holding the hand of her best friend, Cherie. And then the brain
Wow.
would stay quiet. So,
Really?
yeah. So, what is the power of that, right? How do you make people, whether it's virtual or physical, feel like their hand is held? Because how does it make them feel better in the moment? And ultimately, it's a matter of not if, but when, ultimately, we are going to prove the power of peer to peer support and eliminating loneliness, number one, and those feelings. And number two, making people feel better. And ultimately, number three, becoming better. And so I just have always been aware of it. And as a result of kind of launching a community and watching people connect in their most vulnerable moment of time and watching them support each other, it became clear. I mean, For every time that somebody who used my counter pain and was part of our community posted about themselves, they would comment 4 times more than they posted. So they were spending a lot of time helping others. And what is the power of that? And I know, Chris, you and me have met so many people who have all had a response to whatever their adversity was, to want to go out in the world and try to make it better for others. And I think that's all intertwined.
Wow. Which is just so cool. As you were first saying that, I was brought back to Africa when we were in Africa. We had a liaison who was an Australian Kiwi woman who was a missionary there, and has worked with a bunch of the hospitals. And she was just, I mean, it was just, she's this woman, Sarah Wallace. I can never get her married name right, but just hysterical just because she was fluent in Swahili, but she had that like Australian sort of needle that she would just give people a hard time. And she was this red haired, white skinned woman who would go and talk to these people. And they're like, who are you? This picture doesn't meet the sound at all. Like, I
Right.
understand what you're saying. And she was just phenomenal in making sense of the world around us there.
Yeah.
And she said that the Maasai, who are a nomadic people, and you look at it and go, what a difficult existence, just to be going from place to place. You don't have a permanent home. You don't have that sense of security. And she said that there's almost no incidence of suicide in the Maasai society because they're never alone.
Right. I've been doing some work in the healthcare space, and I had an opportunity to interview a child psychologist from out of Boston. And we were talking about social media and whether social media was bad for you or good for you. And he said, the issue with social media is it can be good for you. He said, the problem is that there are times, especially with teenagers, where something on social media has warranted a feeling of shame. And when you and I were growing up and we had a moment where someone hurt our feelings or someone did something that was really mean, we were often surrounded by people that would say, oh, don't worry about it, or it's going to be okay. And he said the issue is teenagers are having those shamed moments late at night under their covers by themselves. And there's no ability for someone in the immediate moment to give perspective on, that it's going to be okay, or let me put it in perspective, or to crack a joke. I mean, how many times growing up did your feelings get hurt where you were crying and one of your friends said something to you and you laughed through your tears?
Right.
Right.
And
So go ahead. I just feel
well,
like that tribe is, they're always together, they know each other well.
well, it's they do, and it's interesting that you talk about shame. I read a book about shame. It was like, So You've Been Shamed, and it was talking about exactly that on social media, where something where you put something out and not without the intention, and it blows up, and you've been shamed, and your life is changed as a result. And it's exactly opposite of what you were talking about in terms of this connection with your best friend. Because if you're shamed, you're completely ostracized, and it is worse in a lot of ways than the feeling of death. Than dying, is that being shamed, being that bad. And so those two things on the opposite, being diametrically opposed, are such a challenge. And it can be so easy.
And throw one more thing in there, which I did see Monica Lewinsky get interviewed at the Nantucket Project at an event once, and she said, the thing about what ended up happening with me is that there were no limitations. It was endless in all dimensions. There was no way to close it off and siphon it. It just it keeps going and going and going, and that's a relevant point too.
It does, and there's nowhere to hide, right? I
Right.
mean, it's almost like when we were kids, you could go to your house and you could hide or whatever, or you could be with your friends or whatever it was, but you could hide. In this, there's no, and you don't know
Yeah.
how it's multiplying
Right.
while
Right.
you're not watching. I mean, just
I also think
absolutely.
that in the world of, MS specifically too, allowing people to be vulnerable and share, their biggest fears online with getting away from the your bright and shiny bullshit, which I think does happen on the Instagrams and the Facebooks, of really being honest. There are communities out there that do allow you to share that things aren't going well, or that you're deeply scared, and the power, if you can create a safe environment for people to really talk about their experience that way, um, and have people around who have wonderful intentions to make you feel better, is incredible. And it's possible.
And it happens on a few levels too, right? I mean, because part of it is you have the supportive group, and the other part is that sometimes when you say something out loud, it's not nearly as powerful as it is rattling around in your mind.
Right. Yep. It's
Now,
true.
you asked me a while ago in our rambling discussion here, what was the most difficult part after my accident. And the most difficult part for me really was, I was saying that it was action was the easy part. It was not knowing how other people could see me, and specifically the opposite sex. It's one of those, you're like, okay, am I ever going to get a date again?
Right. Like you'd be perceived as less of a person.
Entirely, entirely. And it's kind of almost like, and it sounds like you were much more proactive in terms of second date, going, look, this is what's going on. Do you know what this is? And I wasn't armed nearly as well as you were, in that, thinking, okay, well, it's kind of like you have to fall in love before you can have a first date.
Yeah.
You're like, here, this is who I am. This is it. Now you know everything, as opposed to sort of that dating arc where you learn a little bit here and you learn a little bit there. You're on your best behavior to start off with, and then you learn a few other things and stuff like that. And that
Yeah.
was the biggest challenge. And I felt like, if I could be, in some ways, if I could be bigger than life,
Yeah.
then I could be okay. And that's where that was my battle, was, okay, I can go out and I can win this and I can win that. And it's almost like I can escape the orbit of this world that I'm in.
Well, you can be an exception to the rule, right? There are people in wheelchairs, and then there are people in wheelchairs, right?
It really is. And it's an interesting sense of this sense of inclusion. I mean, we're talking about inclusion so much in our world right now too, is like, do you continue to be who you are, or do you sort of morph who you are in order to fit in? I was reading a book about Howard Bryant wrote this book, and it's called Full Dissidence, and it was about his introduction said that every black athlete is a dissident.
Hmm.
And one of the points that he made in it was that, if you have, like, in a boardroom, if you have an African American person in the boardroom, have you changed the color, or have you changed the narrative?
Hmm. Wow.
A- And I think that there's sort of an interesting thought for all of us too, that it's kind of like, how do we fit into our world, and how does our world accept us as well?
Well, there is one distinction that I just want to finish with on this part is, the thing that gave me the advantage, because we are on the same time frame, is that I could go up to that person and I could say, "Do you know what MS is?" And then the next line would be, "Well, it's a crapshoot. I'll either go this way, like things won't work well, or this way." Where what you were dealing with was a very evident truth that probably wasn't going to change. Do you know what I mean?
It's an interesting thought, right? Because the thing is, for you, in some ways, you're a lottery ticket. It's kind of like, it could
Right.
go this way,
That's
it could
right.
go that way. and
That's
and
right.
for me, it's kind of like, it's not going to get any worse.
Right.
Eh,
This is
but
it.
but
But
this
it's
is
here.
this is what it is, right?
Right. And you can see it, and everybody else can see it. Right. I mean, the feeling of how people were perceiving you, I'm sure on a daily basis, you deal with people making judgments about you without even knowing you.
I most assuredly do. And you know what? I most assuredly make judgments about other people without knowing them. This is part of the human thing. And I think that that's some of what I saw in your film, was trying to get beyond the diagnosis,
Yeah.
to see the individual, to see the character, to go,
Right.
oh, I like that person. and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I like that person. And MS has nothing to do with it. It's not like, oh, I like you because you have MS. I mean, that's like a weird thing to say, right? I like you because you're in a wheelchair. Like, oh,
Right.
okay, all right. I don't know what to
Yeah,
make of
right.
that. It's like,
Right.
but I think that's kind of the interesting part. So for you as a total kick-ass 34-year-old,
Mhm.
you felt lonely prior to the diagnosis as a result of not necessarily having a partner. How did the partner part, because I know that there is a partner part of it now, because
Yes.
I'm on the inside. But how
Yes.
how did that how did that happen? And was there a personal journey to get to the point where you actually could have a partner as well?
So, in my 30s, I just felt like I was meeting a lot of people and I felt like I wasn't finding the right person. And, interestingly enough, the day I was diagnosed, I was going out on a third date with someone that I thought I really liked. And we were supposed to go out that night. And I called him from the hospital and I said, um, I can't meet out with you tonight. I just got diagnosed with MS. And,
Okay.
and maybe that was a little too honest because I never saw him again. But at the same time, I think that there's enormous power in throwing out the truth. So I recognize it was such a big part of my life that it was taking a lot of my brain space, and so I had to be honest about it. And I had a range of opinions from people I went out with. Most of them didn't care. One person actually did say, I think you're sexier because of your MS, which may have been a little weird. We didn't get married. Um,
Did you have the follow-up there of like, why do I appear sexier because of my MS?
he just was impressed that I could own it so matter of factly, right?
Which makes sense. That's really cool.
Yeah, the power of being like, it is what it is. And you've got that too. Um, and so ultimately, the guy that I ended up meeting, Tyler, he had had a family member who had dealt with a neurological condition that was kind of similar to MS called
Mhm.
ataxia. And he had seen firsthand kind of a worst case scenario or a tough case scenario. And we were totally honest on date two, and he just made a conscious decision. It didn't factor into what he wanted. So, I am forever grateful that he took that chance. And it's funny because we've actually developed a way of communicating about my MS because there are times where I don't feel 100%, and we've put the MS in a number system. So I'll say to him, because I don't want to over talk about it because then I'll fester. So I'll say I'm having an MS moment, and he'll say, "What's the number?" And we go from 1 to 10, and 4 or 5, he doesn't really say anything. If I say 8 or 9, the dude goes into like Mach 10, like cancels plans to
Right.
make sure everything's taken care of or whatever else. So it's really nice to have that. And, we've been really lucky. And I do believe that, if or when my MS takes a different turn, he will cross that bridge when he gets to it and do the best he can to be supportive.
Okay, so I did some research on you,
Yes.
and you mentioned that you didn't put the camera on yourself after the phone call, but I
Yes.
did see a photo of the two of you in Central Park on a blanket. Now, did you have the photo when he proposed to you in Central Park?
Well, my husband happens to be so thoughtful, and he recognized that I'm such a huge fan of documentation that he ended up hiring a paparazzi style photographer to shoot the entire proposal. So we ended up going out to Central Park. He claimed we were meeting friends that I didn't know. And when we got to Central Park, he called the photographer who had been waiting in the park for 2 hours. And they were able to connect under the guise that he was telling some friends where we were. And she shot the whole thing, 1,000 photos, without me even realizing it. So I got a real appreciation of celebrities because I didn't have a clue I was being followed or pictures. And 2 months after we got engaged, he just dropped the DVD on my desk without saying a word, and I popped it in and was like, "Holy shit!" And it was pretty awesome.
Was the DVD the way that you had remembered it too? Did
Yeah.
it match what you had in your mind?
Yes. It was just so cool to see it from a different angle and professionally shot. I'll send you the video we made of it, um, which I think you'll appreciate. It was a really loving, wonderful thing to do.
That is absolutely hysterical. I
Yeah.
was totally fishing in that
Yeah.
question. I figured that afterwards you'd gone back and you said, okay, well, we can, this is part of the story. It's written into the story. We can have it. No, it was actually done beforehand. So this is somebody who really knew you. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously you're getting married, so hopefully he knows you, but
Well, it had only been 5 months since our first date that he popped the question. So arguably, we really didn't know each other. It took me like a year to realize the guy had studied at Oxford. He was like, I was like, "You went to Oxford?" And he's like, "Yeah." I mean, it's funny when things move fast, but it was very clear. I ended up getting married when I was 37 years old, and it was very simple. And I'm super psyched that I waited it out to recalibrate and kind of reset who I was. And that's a risk to shoot high and hope you find the right guy, especially if you want a family. But I'm really lucky to say it worked out. And it's wonderful to be that person who gets the phone call from the newly diagnosed 35-year-old who thinks their life is over. Because certainly, if there's any part of the story that they like to hear, it's the fact that I found the prince.
well, which is so great as well. And when you think from 34 to 37, things could have gone south for you so quickly that, some of the instinct is, let's get married now because at least now, like I'm bringing something to the table that's, I mean, not to be pejorative or anything, but that's worthwhile, right? That you look at it in your own mind, like this is the stuff that's going in your own mind, and not to put anybody down by any means, but it's these are the things that we think, like, I better, like, I look as good now as I'm ever going to look, which is, also part of being 34 as well,
Right?
right? Is like,
Yes.
well, I should get married now because it's only going to get
Go
worse,
downhill.
as I MS or not.
And before I met my husband, I was dating somebody for about 6 months who was a wonderful person, unbelievably accomplished, and had all of his ducks in a row. But I felt like instinctively it just wasn't the right person. And when I told my mother we broke up, she hung up on me.
Oh no.
Yeah, because I think she had that same mindset. Get
Of like,
something, get something good enough.
you're not going to have another chance at this.
Yeah.
And did you one believe that you were going to have, that you would have more chances, and did you anticipate the proposal? Did you have any idea that that was happening?
I was doing the work when I met my husband on accepting the fact I might not meet the right guy and what would my life look like. And what I concluded was it was actually going to be really interesting and really awesome. And that's, what they say, the moment you stop thinking about it, it happened. And by date three, we both were like, oh my God. And we got in, he moved in after 3 months, engaged after 5 months, walking down the aisle at 9 months, and pregnant the day after on purpose.
Wow.
So I actually came home from the honeymoon and called my amazing twin brother and said, now I'm a little freaked out. I might have moved a little fast. And he said, don't worry, Kate, you got 10 months to get used to the fact that like you're having a baby. It's all going to work out. And he was right.
Wow, that is absolutely incredible. But it is in some ways that pheromone too, right? Of like, okay, I'm not desperate. I'm not.
Right.
I am who I am, and I know who I am, which is ultimately how we get together. Which is, I would imagine, part of when that 35-year-old calls you and says, "Hey, my life is over."
Yeah.
That it's the message that you're able to pass on.
Yeah, look, it's really, and I'm sure you can relate too, because I know you married later. It's really hard to believe that there's enough time to do what you want and to get what you want. It's really hard. But I feel like, as a 35-year-old, there is time. There is time. It's just making an effort. You know what I mean? And I was certainly proactive in my journey, and I'm sure you were too.
What is next? I know that the film is coming out. It's going to get a wider distribution. How will the film be distributed? So it's Beneath the Surface.
Yep. Beneath, and right now it is on a website. The Nantucket Project has put it out on beneaththesurfacefilm.com. Novartis is talking about how they want to distribute. And I think that pre-COVID, there were a lot of ideas of kind of going across the country in town halls. I mean, one of the things, besides being a great portrayal of 10 individual people living with MS, along with some caregivers and a doctor, some doctors, is the message of it is all about the power of connection. So I think this idea of kind of really trying to physically connect people was something that we were really excited about, and we're just going to have to see how that plays out. So, but I want to believe that Novartis has channels all over the world of putting it out there, and to their credit, this was a film project that they did not want to feel like a quote Novartis film. And so they were, the film is unbranded. And to their credit, that they did not have any editorial control on the project, or they didn't put any editorial changes. They accepted the fact that there was a vision, and I just give them huge credit for like rolling with it, just to kind of show this. And I think it's a timely message, because people needing to connect, but also really talking about the healing power of being proactive and finding people to make yourself feel better. And I think that the science, in terms of, whether it be the thing I told you about the scan and the best friend, or they're beginning to kind of really start seeing the power of this type of thing scientifically. So I think the timing of this film project is pretty good.
What are your hopes for it?
So, I really hope it spurs people to find a community. I would love to create some sort of community or be part of a community that really allows people to take ownership of their own healing with MS. Although My Counterpain is a wonderful platform that would be incredible for that. We've decided to keep it on ice, just because trying to make that into a business when it had such a huge mission was a real struggle. And ultimately, really thinking about how, I think over time, when you do a venture, and you try something, you become hyper aware of what you're good at and what you're not good at. And I feel like having a tech platform tied to my ankle is not quite as agile as kind of just trying to be out in the world advocating for people to find their own connections. So I hope to continue talking to people living with MS and interacting and connecting them to each other for a long time. I mean it very seriously, that I think that, especially running a startup enterprise and being a freelancer and my own CEO, that I've never been more tired and stressed. Oh, and I have two kids too, and an amazing husband and a dog. But all of that, arguably, I've never been more tired and stressed, but my MS remains stable. And I feel like all those characters in the film and the people I know are my force field, and they keep me healthy. So I'm totally incentivized to keep doing the work. Unsure exactly what it looks like at this moment, but I'm excited to kind of roll into this chapter of life where people recognize isolation and loneliness is serious, because I do think more solutions will be put out to help people with MS and beyond.
And not just an MS story. In a lot of ways, it's a universal story too.
Right.
And how about for Kate Milliken? What is next for? There's always something, right? Or multiple things going on. What about you? What's the next project? Are we allowed to know?
So there's actually some stuff in the works, and the answer is no. I say that with a lot of love. But
I'll
look,
take it that
I
way.
think it's all okay. I think it's all in this space of advocacy, and also, helping people tell their stories. I spent the past year and a half actually working for an organization called HIMSS, which is a governing body of all healthcare IT. And we did a lot of content around what's happening in healthcare today, and the combination of kind of humanity and technology and convention. It's all being thrown on its head now. So, one example is that hospital systems in the country, 5% use telehealth, and nobody really wanted to change, and now 95% are. So I think there's a bigger shift on the healthcare space of really recognizing how things are changing, as compared to they are. And there's a lot of content I think that needs to be built around that.
I think that sounds great. I mean, obviously, anybody who gets the opportunity to work with you to be part of anything that you're doing is a very lucky person. So we look
Thank
forward
you.
to seeing what happens next and how we might be involved. And we'll certainly put show notes out there so that people can follow you and figure out how to how to be a part of an amazing movement, which really is started in MS, but is also human, and that's
Yes.
the beauty of what you're doing.
Thank you, Chris. It's always such a pleasure to commingle with you. And, let's keep talking for sure. And I really appreciate all this time.
It's always a pleasure, and thank you, Kate.
Woo! See you later.